Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you this morning to our session, a tale of two recoveries, who's winning and who's falling behind, who's left behind. I will be your facilitator for today. My name is Jason Shaddix. Just let me know if you guys need anything. There will be some Q&A at the end of the session. So I'll have the mic, so I'll come around to anyone who has any questions. So that'll be about the last 10 minutes. It's about a 45-minute session, so that last 10 minutes will be for your Q&A. Right now, I want to turn this over to our moderator today. His name is Ken Corbin.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what we're calling a tale of two recoveries. My name is Ken Corbin. I actually have two positions at the IRS, so two recoveries. Two is fitting for me. I am your Chief Taxpayer Experience Officer at the IRS, responsible for your experiences, whether you are coming through customer service or enforcement or compliance, as we call it. My other job, or my other day job, is as the Commissioner of the Wage and Investment Division. Now, you're probably sitting there saying to yourself, what is a wage and investment? What we do basically is we're responsible for processing all of the tax returns, any walk-in sites that you go into. We also are responsible for all of the phone systems and calls that come in. And we are also responsible for our volunteer program called VITA and TCE. So we like to look at our division. When you think of wage and investment, think of the gateway to the IRS. We are probably your entry point or interaction that you would have with our agency. I'm joined here by this esteemed panel who will introduce themselves. But one of the questions that I'm going to ask this morning is, what was a moment for you during the pandemic? And so for me, the moment was after our agency had issued the first round of the economic impact payments to those who were eligible to receive those payments. And in that moment, I was going through social media, and I was able to see the reaction of those families and taxpayers who had received those economic impact payments. You could read the excitement in what they were writing, how desperately those funds were needed to help them meet their ends. But I also read those who did not receive their payment and who were looking for a way to figure out how to get their payments. That was a moment for us at our agency. It was the moment that we knew we had to do better. It was the moment that we knew that we played a vital role in the recovery of our country when it comes to the pandemic. Aaron, introduce yourself and tell everyone what was the moment for you.
Great, thanks, Ken. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm Aaron Levy. I'm the Director of Individual and Community Preparedness at FEMA. So what does that mean in non-Fed speak is I would say that I probably have one of the best jobs in the federal government. It is our team's role to help all of you, your families, your communities, your faith-based institutions become more resilient to disasters. We're one of the few parts of FEMA that actually deal directly with the American people and community organizations before a disaster strikes. And we do this through youth preparedness. We do this through building capacity via training. We do this for supporting community emergency response teams, which are wonderful volunteers. I'm sure many of you have them in your communities. We also, through our partnership with Operation Hope, do it through financial preparedness. I'll probably talk a little bit about that a little later. And most of all, we do it through preparedness actions. What I like to say is, folks, I'm in the behavioral change business. That's the business that we're in. Our job is to try and use our tools to encourage each and every one of you to understand the risks of where you live and what steps you, your family members, and your community members can take to become more resilient to the hazards in your area. So what was my moment? From January 20th, 2021 until about the end of April, I had the pleasure, we call it in the federal government a detail. It's like a temporary assignment. I was asked by our acting administrator, so this is the career executive that takes over when the political appointee leaves, to serve as his senior counselor for the first 4 months of this year in the middle of a global pandemic. His name's Bob Fenton. He, like to say, if there was a David Petraeus of FEMA, probably our most well-known career emergency manager, it's probably Bob. And for the first time ever, the president asked us to set up community vaccination centers. And we did it in underserved communities using social vulnerability index data and census data. And we had never done anything like this before. And we opened up the first one in Oakland, California, at the Coliseum. And Bob went out there and we saw these huge lines of people. People were waiting in line for hours, people of different colors, different creeds, but mostly on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And we were standing there, and to see someone tear up when they were sitting in a wheelchair getting that first shot. And I watched one of our great volunteers say, "Ma'am, are you okay?" And she said, "I have 11 grandchildren and I haven't seen them since this started." And right then and there, it redoubled my belief in that with the federal government, in partners with the Red Cross and our partners in the public and private sector, can be a force for good in this country. And it gave me the strength to carry on with that mission. So thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Arjit Roy. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I represent Truist Financial Services. At Truist, I have a few roles. I lead the deposit product business, which essentially means any relationship you have with Truist where you're saving your money with the bank. My team takes responsibility for that. I also lead small business banking. I lead analytics, and I lead strategy for the retail community bank. We are your consumer-facing franchise, and so what makes this so real for me and my team and our leadership team is we see what's happening on the other end of an account. We see what's happening on the other end of a checking relationship. We see what's happening on the other end of a small business relationship. We see what's happening on Main Street. And to see this happen in real time, it's a slow-moving catastrophe that's taken hold since March of 2020. All of us remember where we were when things started to kind of unfold. And to watch the country's resilience, to watch humanity, and to watch it through the transactions that we see and the relationships and the encounters that we have is just it's just mind-boggling. And so it's a real privilege to be here. It's a real privilege to be at this forum. I'll share my moment. All of us have, there are so many moments, but I think all of us remember actually a couple of weeks prior to the pandemic, what was playing out in Italy. And the news was talking about the pots and pans and the people coming out and singing in the balconies. And we all thought, oh, it's something that's happening over there. It's never going to get here. We kind of dismissed it. And then it started to get real, and the stories out of New York started coming out with the healthcare workers and and again, it was, it's happening over in New York. It's never gonna get here, and somehow we'll find a way, out of this. And it's just gonna be a problem over there that's not going to impact us until it did. Until we were all cooped up at home and we were all ordering groceries through Amazon. And for me, the moment got real when we heard the story out of Truist, out of our bank. And it was a story of this one individual that took a call in a contact center. And the client on the other end of the call was having some trouble with online banking. And the contact center teammate was actually in North Carolina. And in the course of the conversation, realized that the client had a child that had special needs and was really looking forward to getting, of all things, a basketball hoop installed at home. And the call could have ended. It could have been a very nice, hey, it's been terrific. Good luck with the basketball hoop, and let's all hope this thing kind of clears away in a couple of weeks. And what this individual did was actually called somebody that was in the hometown in Georgia, and the individual decided the person A called person B. Person B decided that they would actually go to a grocery or a sports store, buy a basketball hoop, drive home to the client's place and actually install it. We all heard that story and it blew us away. And there were thousands of these stories. There were stories about missed chemotherapy appointments. There were stories about doctor's appointments and medical payments. And that's when we realized that at the end of it all that's kept us alive is humanity. And it doesn't, you can be in the federal agencies, you can be in the private sector, you can be in the nonprofit sector. And what's kept us alive and the resilience of this country is stories like this. And so that was my moment, and it really struck a chord.
Well, I'm noticing I shouldn't have said at the end of the row here on these stories. These are great. So good morning. I'm Trevor Riggin. I'm the Senior Vice President for Disaster Cycle Services at the American Red Cross. That's a mouthful, so I'll unpack that a bit, and I'll caution. It's my first public speaking event since the pandemic started in person. So if I forget some of my social protocol, let me know. So I oversee our domestic disaster program. So there's three big parts to that. One is preparedness, and much like Aaron, we work very closely with FEMA and emergency managements all across the country, but also local agencies in providing person-to-person preparedness education. A lot of that's with children. We do classes with a program called the Pillowcase Program, where we teach in schools, third, fourth, and fifth graders how to build an escape plan, how to think about dealing with a crisis. Things like there's an exercise called breathing in colors, where you breathe in the good, breathe out the bad. Those simple things can help a child really, survive through a crisis. And I think those have all played out well during COVID. We have another program called Prepare with Pedro, which, if you haven't seen it, is an amazing activity book for young children that just has been hard to keep on the shelves. Aaron and I were talking about that earlier. It's hard to keep on the shelves, and that's a partnership that FEMA's helped us form. We also install free smoke alarms all across the country. So hundreds of thousands of free smoke alarms. We go into people's homes. The smoke alarm is actually just the giveaway. It's the thing we do that can save lives, but it's also the way we get into somebody's living room and teach them about preparedness and create a relationship about how to make that behavioral change that Aaron talked about. So that's on the preparedness side. In response, we do everything from responding to a house fire. More than 200 times a day, there are Red Cross volunteers who get up and rush out to be a part of a house fire response. Here in Georgia, more than 15 to 20 families a day lose their homes to house fires. And there are teams of volunteers that go out and respond to those, and we provide financial assistance and recovery support to get them through that. And then, of course, we respond to big disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, which the last 4 or 5 years have seen this rapid acceleration due to climate change and many other factors. And then the third is recovery. And recovery is one that I think for most of us, even as we talk about today, it's a bit of a misnomer. Recovery makes you think you're just trying to fix it back to the way it was. In many ways, it's actually repair, right? There were things broken before the disaster happened. There will be things broken afterwards, but the more things we can fix, the better we can put equity back in the conversation for families. And that's what we're trying to do in our recovery program, is trying to change that conversation about recovery to something that's changing an outcome for the family, not just putting another Band-Aid in place. And we're a long way from solving that problem. But it's one of the reasons I'm excited about the panel today, because I think we're all in that work. The story for me, the first thing that came to mind was I was doing an interview months ago, and the guy told me he had a pet in the house. I can't remember what news agency it was, but it was on Zoom, like many of us do now. And all of a sudden, a parrot flies out of his lap and sits on his head, a big red parrot, and then flies off his head down back on his lap. Of course, I couldn't react because I'm live on camera doing this thing. But that wasn't the story. That's just first thing came to mind. The story was actually from Iowa. So for me, disasters are all about individual stories for families, not the big numbers or the big crisis. The derecho in Iowa that happened back in August, right after the pandemic started, was really the first large event that we dealt with. And we really refashioned our team to be virtual. We were focused on workforce safety and how do we make sure we keep all of our volunteers and staff safe and our clients. How much could we do virtual? And I happened to be visiting my parents in Illinois when the derecho happened, and so drove over to Iowa to see that firsthand. And I was driving through one of the neighborhoods, and you may not know this, but there's a large sub-Saharan African refugee population in Cedar Rapids in Iowa. They work in the meatpacking industry there. They've been there for a long time, but relatively unknown in the Midwest, this population exists there, and they were heavily impacted. As with every disaster, those that are most vulnerable are the most impacted, and it happened again in Cedar Rapids. And I was talking to one of the families through one of our volunteers who happened to speak French. And just as we talked to this family, learning not only had they suffered the tragedy of what had happened to them before they were refugees, and come to America, found a place to settle, now gone through this disaster, but COVID, they were almost completely blind to what was going on. Information was not available readily in the languages that made it appropriate. The community didn't always have the right resources because we were all going through this for the first time in a major pandemic. And so it was a real eye-opening event of, it isn't just the disaster, it isn't just climate change, it isn't just what's going on in our lives before, it's the access to any of the good that's out there. And if we don't provide the access, it's all for naught, right? That family felt like they couldn't access any of those services, that it wasn't for them, it was for somebody else. And so that was a big moment for me personally in how we approached disasters for the last 18 months since then.
Wow. Thank you all for sharing your moments with us here. We know that when you look at the recovery and you look at who's winning and who's left behind, it always depends on the lens or the seat that you're sitting in when you think about the recovery and where we're going. Before we got up here on the stage, we had a discussion about introverts and extroverts, where an extrovert might be thinking, I'm not winning in this, but an introvert might think working at home is a win. We saw during the pandemic that a lot of our service industry employees were harmed. Either they were having to go into work or they had a loss of jobs. Here at the IRS, we issued over $800 billion in 3 rounds of economic impact payments to service industry members and others who were also eligible. But part of what we talk about when we think about how we recover is how do we as heads or leaders in our different agencies inspire our essential workers to understand the vital importance of the role that they play, not only in our economy, but also for providing for their families. You can find that sometimes inspiring or getting people to understand and know where they fit in is a key way for people to know and be inspired to do their jobs. Most service industry providers, though, really have an innate feeling that the work that they do is essential and that they feel that doing that work is important and want to be able to do their job. So I'll put it to any of the panel members here. Talk a little bit about how during this recovery you were able to inspire your essential workers and keep them going during the pandemic.
Yeah, I can start. One way was just through constant communication. It was making ourselves available to talk about anything and everything that people wanted to talk about, not assuming we knew the answers or their concerns. And so small things, holding regular, just very kind of fireside chat conversations with the entire workforce to let them ask questions, paid and volunteer in the Red Cross, right? Our volunteers make up about 90% of our workforce. So most of our essential workers, our frontline folks are volunteers, but making ourselves available to let them ask questions. And that served us well, not only for the pandemic, but also we went through very challenging times in our country, after the murder of George Floyd, and creating space for conversations about how we move through this together, how we let people share how that impacted them personally, but also as an organization. The other part of it, though, on the inspiration, at least in the Red Cross, I think for most service folks, we have a hard time creating boundaries around service. And so our people tend to work more than they can. And I think during the pandemic, many of us have suffered through that, right? Where all of a sudden you're working by Zoom or Teams and your days are not 8 hours long, they're 16 hours long, not because your employer is asking you to do that, but because you're there, right? And so you just keep going. And I think we always see that in disasters where we need our people to work 16, 18-hour days sometimes, but that shouldn't be the norm. And so we've been trying to inspire our folks to create some discipline in their lives, create some boundaries, create some work-life harmony. But it's really difficult in this virtual world we're operating in right now to create those things. But those are just as important as the drive to work more, because we need that rested ingenuity and inspiration to keep people motivated for the next disaster, which we know is coming.
I can take a private sector view on this. And in the private sector, different companies, different institutions react differently. At Truist, we're incredibly fortunate because our performance in large part is driven by our purpose. And we've been incredibly fortunate with a terrific group of leaders as the new company has come together from the merger of two terrific institutions, where Truist's core purpose is about building better lives and communities. And this may sound like an exaggeration, but if you were to wake any one of our 50,000 teammates at 2 a.m. in the morning and ask them about what the Truist purpose was, you would get that response 99.9% of the time. One of our core values is around clients. And when we describe that core value, so we have 5 core values, and the value around clients is when clients win, we all win. And so when you've got an operating framework that starts with that foundation, it actually becomes easy because it's consistent. And so that story I told you about the moment, nobody instructed that teammate to make the call to the person in Georgia to go drive and make that little basketball hoop happen. It happened organically. And so I think for corporations, and we heard Dan Schulman talk about this yesterday, anybody that says performance and purpose are at odds, I think he used a pretty strong word, but anybody that thinks that they don't go together is actually delusional. And so I think for corporations to step up to moments like this, starting at that foundation of how you think about your core purpose, how you think about values, actually makes it a whole lot easier when you start to think about decision making from all the way at the top down at the frontline level.
So I think, to add to these wonderful reflections, I'll start at a 40,000 foot level. FEMA's mission is helping people before, during, and after disasters. Our agency, much like our colleagues at the Red Cross, have been going nonstop since March of 2020. And it's been tough. And allow me to say this, for those of us, especially the folks who I lead at headquarters, we all have 2 jobs. There's our normal headquarters program management job, which I've talked about, which is, developing those programs for individuals and communities. And then just about everybody on our staff, including me, also has a disaster position. So what I was thinking about when we went virtual, how to keep people motivated, that one of our big challenges as a leader from keeping your labor force and your workforce motivated and safe and focused during these difficult times is, do I hold my people back? That when my colleagues around the agency, like Aaron, I need this person to come to the National Response Coordination Center, our big ops center, to help analyze data for the vaccine rollout? Or do I let them deploy? And a lot of my team were unsure. Is it safe for me to go in? Can I stay in a hybrid environment? We had to manage different attitudes during the pandemic. We had never worked in a virtual structure before, so we were literally trying to build the plane as we were flying it. So when I set out as a leader to kind of think about this, I said, how can I put the health and my safety of my employees first? How could I help them fulfill FEMA's mission? And then how can I help them ensure that they're getting some semblance of downtime in between these deployments? And I know that might sound like hyperbole. That might sound like leadership 101. But for those of us who have been going nonstop since March 2020, to keep those principles in mind, every single day was important. And the last thing I'll say was also the power of storytelling. That I cannot stress that enough, especially, for the team that I lead. I think the average age is about 28. They absorb information much differently than I do. What motivates them is much differently than I am. And for me, the more that I could get stories into their hands that said, that Prepare with Pedro book that we developed with the Red Cross, I have a son or a daughter with special needs, and we were cooped up inside. I used that Pedro book to give them a distraction over the course of this pandemic, or I used this as an opportunity to get involved in a youth movement locally that's doing disaster preparedness. The more that the team, because sometimes in Washington, you're in a bubble and you don't really see the output of your work, that was really important to us. And lastly, from a workforce management standpoint, a colleague of mine said this to me, and it really struck home. a lot of people, as Ken mentioned, are happy to be at home at the moment. And for me, as an extrovert, I'm going bananas, right? I mean, to me, like this is like Trevor, this is my first, I haven't been under lights in a year and a half. That's a little weird. But someone said something to me. She goes, Aaron, what you don't understand is that for a lot of us, every day of our professional lives, we had to put on a suit of armor to come into the office because of your sex, because you were a member of the LGBTQ community, because of the color of your skin, because you were harassed, because you were discriminated against. And for that person, working at home has been a blessing because they don't have to put that armor on every day to come to the office. So for us, how are we going to keep motivating people in a future hybrid work environment? By applying those lessons learned for the future. So that's been my challenge.
I love it. I love it. Thank you all for doing that. I promise I won't call at 2 in the morning to check that out. But I love it. I love the communication and I love the dedication that comes through. It definitely represents the winning side of things. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about education. And so before we got on the stage, we were able to make connections between all of our organizations. We all play an essential role in the recovery of our country from the pandemic. But what it really comes down to is getting the word out and education out to those who are underserved or those who may speak a different language. So the next thing I would ask the panel here is to talk a little bit about what have you done to educate your community or educate your clients or your customers to be aware of the benefits that are available to them. At the IRS, we had the opportunity to do, and currently are still doing, the advanced child tax credit, hint, hint. And so what we've been able to do is do outreach events through 27 cities, in-person events, to help get into the communities, because we acknowledge and recognize that not everyone has access to a digital device or to the internet. So that boots on the ground community movement is one of the key ways we use to educate people, not only about the child tax credit, but also about the benefits that are available through tax administration. We've also done a multilingual initiative and tried to convert or put more products in a variety of languages so that our customers will be comfortable and be able to take in and understand the material that we have to present. But in order to make the recovery a winner and to bring in more winners, education and outreach is a key role. So can you all tell us a story? I love the art of storytelling. Tell us a story about how you have gone through the pandemic to help educate and get word out about the services and opportunities you provide.
Since you lobbed the softball on child tax credit, I can talk for hours. I won't, I promise you. It is, the word unprecedented is used a lot, and it's used so much that they ought to retire it after this year. But in the context of stimulus and how the federal government and agencies are helping the population, it actually is an unprecedented time. You mentioned the EIP payments that, as a financial services sector, we were on the receiving end of, literally and figuratively, as you stood that program up from the federal government. In the early days of the pandemic, I have several colleagues here in the room with me where guidance on the EIP and the PPP from Washington was changing on an everyday basis, sometimes on an hourly basis. And so for us as the financial services sector to rise up and meet that moment is critical in that supply chain and making sure that the right credits, the right stimulus get to the right families and the right households. And so that's just a baseline state. In terms of the child tax credit as well, what was different about it and what continues to be different about it as the bill snakes its way through Congress as they're thinking about it being a permanent credit, is that rather than a one-time $1,400 payment or a two-time $1,400 payment, this is actually a string of payments. And so and this is what makes this disaster or this, what we're living through unprecedented as well, is that you actually have an opportunity to change Aaron, I think you used the word, we're in the behavioral change business. You actually have an opportunity for decades, you have families that haven't built up the habit of savings. And so what you're seeing with the child tax credit is a string of 6 payments starting in the summer, ending in December, where a family that wasn't expecting $300 a child is now getting potentially thousands, depending on the number of children and the taper out, an opportunity that they didn't have those additional dollars to save and sock away for a rainy day fund. And so what we've done with education in order to meet the moment was 3 things. And so the first thing we did is that we actually educated our teammates. Remember the 50,000 number I threw out? I mean, across 15 states, getting those teammates that actually meet with clients on an everyday basis and getting them aware of the string of payments coming and an opportunity for a family to change their trajectory is invaluable. And so there is no substitute for that in-person communication. The trust that you build, and you've got a trusted individual, either in a teller line or a banker that's talking about the stimulus and adding credibility is huge. The second thing we did is we also realized that, believe it or not, and much to our chagrin, not everybody wakes up in the morning wanting to go to a bank or drive to a branch. And so there are other ways to get the word out. And so we really focused our marketing and our advertising to drive the relevance of these string of payments that were coming. And so we drove the word out that way. We used podcasts. And the third thing we did is we actually, in partnership with the United States Treasury Secretary, Michael Schmidt, and by leading a group of like-minded financial service institutions through forums like the BPI, actually organized a sectoral response to not only drive awareness of the credit up, but also provide access. And so it's not sufficient that somebody is aware of the child tax credit if they can't really access it because they don't have a bank account. And so those are ways that financial service, the sector itself, institutions, and those institutions, particularly that lead with purpose, can actually step into a white space and fundamentally change the trajectory for millions of households in America.
So real quick, I used 2 items. I'm going to go back to 2017, and I think most of you remember the disaster season from 2017. I want to put yourself in a neighborhood in Houston. It's been flooded. There are 2 homes that are relatively identical in that neighborhood. One home has flood insurance. The other home does not. Both homes totally destroyed by flooding. The home with flood insurance got a $120,000 payout via their insurer. The home without flood insurance, the maximum payout they got from FEMA was about $30,000. So we started to ask ourselves why, according to this, something we do called the National Household Survey, why do only 22% of American households have flood insurance? Guess what, folks? If it rains where you live, your home could flood. So we had that coming out of 2017. Then we had the pandemic, which I think showed all of us who didn't already know it before about the inequities and the lack of equity in the delivery of a lot of our programs. So what are we doing about it? So at the moment, our programs are looking to do 2 things. Number one, for the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, I don't mean to sound bureaucratic, but bear with me. We're making sure that there's fairness in that program. And let me explain to you what that means. A person living in a home in a lower middle class community, which they've inherited through generations and are living in a floodplain, they should not be paying more for their risk in insurance than the person with a second home on a beach on the Carolina coast, okay? That is equity. That is fairness. And what we're trying to do now as my colleagues at FEMA look to reform that program is to make sure that we're actually going to try and reduce the rates for about 1 million people to get flood insurance. So those folks who need it the most can't afford it. And we're finally going to work with Congress to do something called making it actuarially sound, which is going to be key. Second thing I'll say from the perspective of my program is I'm going to totally suck up now to our hosts, is we have a wonderful product with Operation Hope called the Emergency Financial First Aid Kit, or EFAC. When I first got to the division and someone told me that we have a warehouse that we send out documents for, I said, wait a minute, it's 2020. Why am I spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year of taxpayer money to send documents out to mailboxes around the country? Because me, as a privileged upper middle class guy, didn't realize that a lot of folks simply can't afford a phone or they can't afford an iPad. And so what we've done to recognize that English is a second language for so many Americans, we've translated that document in partnership with Operation Hope into 5 key languages, and we're engaging with folks from the National Council of La Raza to Asian American organizations around the country to find what the op-ed columnist David Brooks calls the weavers in communities. You know, sometimes when I show up with a FEMA shirt on, they don't want to hear from me, but they do want to hear from their pastor, the person who runs their community bank, or the person who runs their homeless shelter, et cetera. So I hope that answered the question. I want to make sure I give my bud Trevor a little time.
No, thanks, Aaron. And I'll pick right up where you left off. So I'll use an image maybe more than a story. So many of you have probably seen that famous equity versus equality image, right? Of the three guys trying to watch the baseball game, and how, one of them needs, two of them need another box to stand on to see over the fence. In equality, we give them all one box, right? In equity, you give one more boxes. I saw a twist on that the other day, which I found fascinating, where that image, which we've probably all seen in many diversity conversations, assumes that the fence is not the problem. And in reality, for many people, the fence is the problem, because the fence is higher for them than it is for others. The starting point is different. And so if you can imagine that third person who needed the 2 boxes to see over the fence to watch the baseball game, they actually were starting in a hole, not on the grass. And now, because of climate change, that hole is quickly filling up with water, and it's on fire. And that all starts before anything else happens, before you layer on the pandemic, before you layer on anything else going on in the community: food insecurity, poverty, lack of good health care, education. All those things create they put somebody in the starting point that is so much lower than others by no fault of their own, but simply because of where they are and who they are, and what community they're a part of. And so we've looked really hard at how we change, how we look at the communities we want to serve, and how we think about equity, and how we start first in the communities who need us the most. And so, learning much from Operation Hope, honestly, they were having this conversation with us 10 years ago about how we think about equity differently, of how we show up in vulnerable communities quickly. And so we've started to target Hurricane Ida just recently. We targeted 22 different census block level communities to start in first, to put boots on the ground, to Ken's point, and start talking to communities one-on-one, to start providing outreach to families that don't have access to cell phones, that don't have access to the internet, especially during a disaster. That's so important to provide that education. The other side of that's not my world, but part of the Red Cross, which I think is important to mention, is our blood collection. So you think about the education. Imagine you have sickle cell disease. So imagine you have a disease that is so painful that you need blood transfusions, but you have to depend on the generosity of strangers to donate their blood that happen to have those traits in order for you to survive, right? Imagine being in that position, and so many people in our country are in that position. And we've launched a huge effort right now, both because of the extreme blood shortage we're a part of. So if you can donate, please do. There's a huge blood shortage right now. But also to educate people on sickle cell disease. Most Americans don't understand that unless they've had somebody in their family who has it. And so that is education for vulnerable communities. It's education for those impacted, and it's education for potential donors. And we've learned so much through the pandemic on how to do better outreach that it's allowed us to do a much stronger push on this effort we're doing right now.
Thank you all very much. Now is an opportunity for you all out here to ask the panel any questions. If you could raise your hand or stand up, the mic will be brought over to you. But I think we're showing how we're all connected. So, yes, sir.
So, Commissioner Corbin, thank you for being here, and thank you to the representative of FEMA. But I think the winner, one of the winners in COVID was Operation Hope, believe it or not. And the winning was because we, for decades, did our work and limped along financially. And when the terrible killing occurred in Minneapolis, the American corporate community discovered us in a new way. And we have really profoundly important donors who joined us, like Truist, who have become absolutely vital to the delivery of services to thousands of people. So I wanted to just tell you that we are on a much better path, but we need everybody in this room for that. So Commissioner Corbin is on the advisory board nationally for this. If you're in Atlanta, he's a great conduit for this. And I want to thank FEMA for all the time that they've been a partner for us. It's been transformational. And look at the partnership we have with other nonprofits right here in the room. So I think if we reflect on that, I'm looking forward to talking with any of you. I'm Steve Ryan. I'm on the global board. If you want to get deeper into Operation Hope. Thanks.
Thank you. Staying connected, staying in communication is critical. And all of us are advocates, every one of us in this room. Yes.
Good morning.
morning.
First of all, great panel. Got a couple of questions for you. For FEMA, you talked about that it rains everywhere in the world. There are a lot of households that would like to have flood insurance, but their insurance companies tell them they don't live in a flood zone. So that's a hurdle that absolutely needs to be addressed. And then I'd like to hear from the group about, does anyone know what the minimum wage is in Georgia? Not the federal minimum wage, but the minimum wage. $5.15. So how can we really, as an organization and individuals, help those that are making that minimum wage get to where they're earning a living wage? I'd like to hear some feedback on that.
So I can take the FEMA question. I'm happy to. So obviously, the National Flood Insurance Program obviously depends upon private companies and private industries. And most of the time, we have some write your own policies. I can really get in the weeds with this, but I won't. It's dependent upon those private companies to actually to sell that insurance policies to those individuals. But I think, sir, what we are trying to do, what both within our existing authorities, I know what Administrator Criswell and Dave Marstead, the Chief Executive of the National Flood Insurance Program, is trying to do, is to work with Congress and work with our partners to take steps to not only lower the cost of insurance, number one, but number two, make sure that we are providing flood mapping. This is so key right now, that to make sure that it's accurate, because this is the most important thing. So many of our maps are outdated, number one. And number two, so many people don't even know they live in a floodplain, which is so important. So I think what we are really now focused on is education efforts to those underserved communities, working with partners like Operation Hope, partners with the American Red Cross and elsewhere, to really do everything that we can, at least externally, outside of Washington, in the field, to try and explain and work with those private sector companies so that it's clear to people that if it rains where you live, your house can flood, number one, and then making sure that they have accurate and timely data available to them to help them make decisions. So I think that's how I would answer that. And sir, I'm happy to have a sidebar with you when we wrap up and go a little deeper if you'd like to, or anybody else for that matter. I think for the economic, we'll cover the minimum wage stuff, I would,
So I'll chime in a little bit and let the other panel members talk about that. But I think to get to a living wage, one, I think that it comes from many different aspects. I think that our government has to play a role in providing the guidance and the pathway to creating a living wage. I also think that in getting there, we have to continue to provide things like the economic impact payments. We have to provide the ability for families to continue in the event, in order to get to that living wage, they need more education opportunities, or they need to be able to get transportation or take care of their families while they're trying to get to the standard of whatever is required for a living wage. I also think, and I'll just say, I always like to say at work, this is just Ken's opinion, I also think that a living wage is important, but I also think that what we've learned in this pandemic is that family and being in your community is significantly important. And to me, more about getting the living wage is also having the time to raise your children, the time to be with your families, to be in your communities, in your churches. So a living wage to be able to afford to do those kinds of things is really the balance, what I think we are all trying to achieve and what you'll find here in Operation Hope. But anyone else have any thoughts or reactions?
Well, so I don't have much to say on how we would change the minimum wage, but we'll say there's a big difference between living and surviving. And I think when we look at that exact example, right, the minimum wage here in Georgia, many times policies, Red Cross, other agencies, federal government, are written somewhere else, right? And we launch efforts from other places, and then you come into a community to help, and all for our world in a disaster, right? Come in to help support a community during disaster, and the context could be so very different from where someone comes from. Or maybe the minimum wage is $15, right, in other states. Now all of a sudden they're in a disaster where that's not the truth. The key to that for us is partnerships. We can't always understand exactly the neighborhood we're walking into, but our partners often do. The partners who are there every day, the weavers who are in that community every day serving, most recently partners like NAACP and Operation Hope, and so many hyper-local agencies and the churches and community groups, they can tell us those stories, right? They can point to us where in the community we need to get help to fastest, because the living situation is just surviving. And we need to rethink how we deliver service, how long we deliver service, where we prioritize. And that's a big shift, right? Because our country has become so uneven in the sense of equity, depending on where you go, that we have to pay attention to those local leaders and trust their knowledge first.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Thanks. This question is for the gentleman from FEMA. I was actually impressed when you stated that you guys focus on a lot of youth preparedness, but we have a foundation where we focus on youth preparedness. We offer grants and so forth. And matter of fact, next year we're having a youth development camp where for free, we are actually teaching kids cultural awareness, how to play tennis and golf, not just being on a specific blue collar sports and whatnot. We're gonna talk to them about getting into colleges and things of that nature. And what we would like to do more than anything is partner with someone like FEMA. We have a partnership with Thriving. I'm sure you're familiar with that, but we certainly would love to have a partnership with you all and see if we can consolidate some of the efforts and ideals that we have and all as with FEMA as it relates to youth preparedness.
Excellent. You're speaking my language. I'm going to make a beeline for you as soon as I get off the stage.
Thank you so much.
No, but absolutely. So I think, again, I'll be honest with you. I have a small team based in Washington. FEMA has 10 regional offices, and there's usually, I would say, 1.5 people who sort of do community preparedness at these regional offices. Our success in building a culture of resilience in this country and encouraging families to prepare, we're actually doing research now. We think if you prepare elementary school and middle schoolers and get them taking those habits to make themselves more prepared for disasters, that their parents will follow along. It's going to depend on organizations like yours, sir, more than mine to make that happen. And I look forward to our discussion. Absolutely. Yep.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here today. I want to say that, our goal here at Operation Hope and all of the different organizations that we represent here is to leave no one behind. And we can do that through education, outreach, and advocacy. And that's for all of us here in the room and those that will replay this later on today. So with that, let me turn it back over.